Welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over the switch configuration for NetFlow for Stealthwatch. And in my lab, I'm using Catalyst 3650s, but depending on which hardware you're using or the iOS version, it might be different syntax or might be a different version of NetFlow supported. So at the end of this video, bear with me, I'm going to actually give you a little cheater way to look up the switch configuration depending on which version of hardware you're using. So let me go over how you would configure NetFlow really quickly, some very basic stuff. So just so we're talking on the same level, let's go over the terminology. So there's three things that you typically need to configure to kind of start out inside, at least for Catalyst switches. The first thing is here, let me pull up my whiteboard. The first thing you'll need to configure is a NetFlow record. And what this does is it basically says, here's all the fields I want to capture. The next thing you would configure is an exporter. And that's basically saying where this will be going to. So that'll be, the IP address of your flow collector, which port to be, sending it on, and what interface to be sending it out of. And the very last thing you would configure is the monitor. That monitor would tie together these two things. It's basically saying, this is the record I'm going to be using and what I'm collecting. This is where I'm going to be sending it to. And here's my active and inactive timeout times. Now, with Stealthwatch, there's a little default that you do have to change. By default, most switches, their active and inactive timeout is somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. The active timeout basically means the flow is, or the conversation is still going and it hasn't ended. And instead of waiting for it to end or seeing a fin packet, it'll, at a certain intervals, it'll send the NetFlow data to the flow collector. And it'll just update it on that active timeout, and the flow collector will update the information it has about that flow. And an inactive timeout is if there is no fin packet, maybe like a UDP stream, for example, and after a certain amount of time, it sends the flow to, when it's inactive, to that flow collector again. And that flow collector essentially sees, continues to add those analytics to its what it has about that flow. So if you have the timer set at the default, Stealthwatch has a problem with being able to actually stitch that together because the timers are all coming too far apart, so it's hard to be able to parse that data and see that it's from the same stream. So the thing we have to change about the default is we want to send the active and inactive time under 5 minutes. So it's not a big deal, but that is something that we do have to include in our configuration. So if you're using if you already have NetFlow configured for, say, SolarWinds or something like that, that's not trying to parse the data for those purposes, and you just re-aim it at Stealthwatch without changing those defaults and including some very basic record information, it's not gonna work. Another key important thing is that with the data, you want to make sure that the record stuff that's being sent in that NetFlow record, there are certain information that's being sent there, or else it's not going to, Stealthwatch isn't going to be able to parse that data. So let me go ahead and pull this up. So in order for this flow record, for Stealthwatch to be able to add this flow record and ingest it, it needs to have a bare minimum match the MAC source address input, the data link MAC destination address input, the data link VLAN input, the IPv4 TTL, TOS, protocol destination address, transport source port and destination port, input, TCP flags, interface output. All of this information here, this is the bare minimum. I do like to add a couple extra things, match IPv4 source address as well as destination. I like to, in newer versions of code, you're actually able to also match the flow direction. And if you have TrustSec enabled, you can actually include the source and destination group tag in that NetFlow record. So I tend to add these little things at the end for the switch config. And then for my flow exporter, as you can see here, the destination IP address is the NetFlow collector, not the SMC. The source VLAN interface is just my layer 3 interface, and we're using the default port of UDP 2055. We also configured that in the flow collector when we were initially setting it up. You can also change that in both the flow collector and the switch if you just like to change it up, but I haven't seen a reason to do so. This is all metadata, so it's not like you have to encrypt it or change that if you want, but you can if you choose to. And so for the flow monitor, as you can see here, we're binding together this exporter here and the record, which was up here, and we're changing those active and inactive timeout. So it's going to be 60 seconds and 15 seconds in my case. And after that's configured, we'll actually configure it on the interfaces themselves. So let's go ahead and go into our switch configuration really quickly. I'll start with switch 1. I'm just going to copy and paste this really quickly and get this in there. So first up, let's copy and paste that flow record. Paste. I'm going to also add those optional fields while I'm at it, but by no means do you have to do this. I'm going to exit, and I'm going to add my flow collector or flow exporter, and then I'm going to add my flow monitor as we discussed. And next I'll go ahead and add this to the port. So this is going to be actually, there we go, I typoed that. So interface range G0. I think this is a 24 port switch, but let me just check. Nope, 48 port. So interface range G1/0/1/48. Paste. Now let's go over to Stealthwatch really quickly, and within a few minutes we should be seeing some traffic starting to come through. So we're only seeing this traffic from originally from my I'm going to also configure the other switch really quickly as well. So let's go ahead and do that really. So once again, just copy and paste the same thing. In this case, this is a 24 port switch, so we're going to just put on all the ports. Now we're starting to see a little bit more data in the last 5 minutes. Let's see if I can actually see some interfaces that's coming from. Yeah, so my switch 1 is starting to show data from it. And in a few seconds, switch 2 as well will come. Now, as I said before, let's go ahead and save this really quick. As I said before, the big thing with this is that different syntaxes can apply depending on what kind of switch or what kind of iOS version. So Cisco made a nice, easy way to kind of check some test configuration. If you go to configure netflow.info, you can pull up some of the more common configurations like ASR, CSR, ISR. So let's say like Catalyst 9K. Let's just go here, select and continue. The 9300. Do we want to enable ETA or not? Let's say enable. Show me the flow config. So it gives you a template of what you would want to do, but if you want to make it even easier, you can sit there and plug in your credential, your collector information. So, and we're going to be sending this from VLAN 100, and I can say that the ports are 0 through 23, and it'll generate the entire just copy configuration to copy and paste in there. So that's a kind of easy way of doing it if you don't want to go through the configuration guide and find your specific iOS version or model. It kind of gives you some of the, breaks it down for you a little bit more. It doesn't have everything, but it's a great way of doing this. Now let's go back over here and take a look at the interfaces. Okay, so we've got more, as you can see here. So I'd actually stopped the video and I was planning on ending it there, but there was something I wanted to come back to really quickly. So there might be cases where, depending on the platform, you're only seeing one direction if you just put input in. So with an example of this, let's say, ignore that. So let's say we did, for one of the switch ports, we did input only, so we're only seeing traffic outgoing. So in some cases, you might have to configure an output record, and it's slightly different. I'm going to configure it right here and show you. So since I mentioned before, NetFlow is a unidirectional record. So you'd have to create a flow record that's basically for output and one for input and assign it to the interface if you wanted that to happen. If you're using this for like networking or other monitoring purposes, that would be really useful. And some platforms, when you configure NetFlow, you'll be able to see it both, but in this case, the 3650, I have to actually configure a output as well to see it, on both sides. So here we go. I've got the flow record output. A lot of it's the same except, data link, VLAN, the destination out. It's all output instead of input like we did with our original flow record. Then I'm going to go ahead and configure the flow exporter, actually, I'll use the same flow exporter. I don't need to configure anything different there. But the flow monitor definitely needs to be different, as well as the flow record. So as you can see here, the names are slightly different. Some of the things that we configured slightly different. Instead of MAC address input, it's output. Data VLAN, it's output. And when we can assign this to an interface, it'll be the new monitor, and it'll be output. So let's do show interface G1/0/1. Show run. That's what I meant. So as you can see here, we have a flow monitor for both input and output. Now I'm going to go over here and reconnect to this guy, switch to, and I'm going to assign the same thing. Almost identical records except just those slight changes. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste my new flow monitor and assign it to the ports. So I might have to give this a second for us to see that change take place, but give it a moment while I do so. I'm just going to refresh, or maybe I could pause the video if it takes a while. So I'm going to go back to interfaces, that's monitor interfaces, and we can actually filter by device, in this case I'm going to filter it by the switch one. Let's see packets per second. So right now it's still showing going one direction, so let's wait for it. I'm going to pause the video and see and come back to it in just a few minutes so I can actually see some of the traffic coming through. Okay, I waited a couple minutes, and as you can see here, now that I zoom in, since we added that, we can see the outbound packets and now the inbound packets. So sometimes you'll have to do that where you have to assign a flow monitor that's for input and output on those interfaces to get both directions. And sometimes you just need to assign the actual flow monitor on like a VLAN or something else. It really depends on the switch model and what you're looking for. But as you can see here, right as we change that, we can see the outbound packets. Before it was just showing everything from inbound. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this video, and the next video is going to be my NetFlow configuration for my CSR.